Hello, this is Dr. Reynolds trying to get my act together here. There we go. I think, I hope. Okay. Let's try again. This will be my third try at trying to record this particular presentation. As we continue our look at ideas that have influenced our views of gender historically and perhaps even contemporarily, I want to talk today about secular and scientific views. Last time we looked at the religious elements, where the ideas about, what does God have to say about the relationships of men and women, and so forth. Well, when we think of it as a philosophical question, here, of course, in the Western tradition, we go back to the ancient Greeks. And the key figure here is Aristotle. Aristotle was a philosopher in the 4th century BCE. And he judged that the key question is, what does it mean to be human? The answer for Aristotle was male is what it means to be human. That men are the epitome of humankind. And so that when you want to look at what should a man, what is a human, you look at a man. So women are sort of men gone wrong, that they literally thought of women as being sort of inverted men, whereas men had their penis and their testicles outside their body, women had their uterus and ovaries inside their body, and that they corresponded to the male organs. Yeah. So the modern scholars have come to call this the one-sex theory, and the one sex is him, right? So this is a very influential, and will be a very influential, view of men and women for quite a few centuries. When we look at medical thinking, here the key figure is a Roman physician from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, named Galen. And he argued that, first of all, women were not passive receivers of a child conceived by men, which is what Greeks and the Greeks thought, but that men contributed, but still men were more important to reproduction because women were colder than men. Okay, what does that mean? Well, here then we are dealing with what's known as the 4 humors, the idea of that human health is a result of the correct balance between these 4 substances: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. These 4 actually fluids also foster or support certain characteristics or qualities, like hot, dry, wet, cold. And then they also correspond to the elements you see listed here from nature: air, fire, earth, and water. So if you were properly balanced with all of these things, you were healthy. When you got sick, then the question for the doctor was, what's out of balance? So the doctor would examine your fluids, right? Not necessarily even looking at your whole body, but say maybe just looking at your urine or your phlegm, your mucus. And he would, on that basis, decide what needed to be done. This is where we get the practice that will last up into the 19th century of bleeding people, of deciding that, okay, what's really out of whack here is you got too much blood. So let's cut open a vein or let's stick some leeches on you and we'll restore the proper balance. The ancients thought that the liver was what produced blood. So what is this then? What's the implication of this for gender? And here comes one of my TAs, Kitty, my cat Nevi. You're not helping. All right. So here you can see a kind of representation, and you can see here we've got phlegm, blood, yellow bile, and black bile, and you have the various qualities of wet, dry, and so on and so forth. Also notice the signs of the zodiac around the edge of that drawing. People often turn to astronomy to also try and figure out what was wrong with people who were born under the wrong star. Maybe you're not helping. Oh, crumbs. What? Okay, so what does this mean for gender? Well, here we have the kind of comparison and contrast that could be done. Men are dry and hot, are the source of life and governed by their higher faculties, like their brains, or things like that. Whereas women, and of course men then are more active, rational, brave, intelligent, and so forth. Women, on the other hand, are wet and cold. Their reproductive organs are the inverse of the male. And their reproductive organs are on the interior because they are cold. They lack heat. So they are weak and passive. But on the other hand, they are also considered to be lustful and irrational. And because they were colder, this is why they had smaller brains and larger hips. I'm not sure quite how that worked. But, so men are the model. Sexual difference in reproduction is not based on, sexual difference is not based on reproduction because both sexes are basically the same thing, except women are inferior. Because women are cooler and moister, they are weaker and more passive. Menstruation was necessary because women did not have enough heat to purify their blood, and so therefore their organs had to be protected. The lack of heat also meant that women did not have the power internally to drive the blood to their heads, to their brains, and so they had bigger hips, weaker minds. One of the things, and we'll still see this in the 19th century, is the idea that once you hit puberty as a woman, you should give up on trying to study, because if you do, you're going to have too much blood go into your head and not to your reproductive organs, and your fertility will be impaired. And so women are governed by their lower parts, their hips, and especially the uterus, and they are thus more susceptible to insanity, hysteria, this kind of thing, lust, and so forth. And this view of one sex but different balances will be the predominant medical view of gender difference into the 19th century. All right. Before we get to the 19th century, however, in the 17th and 18th century, we have what is usually known and referred to as the scientific revolution where we have the emergence of scientific method, where one sets out a hypothesis, designs an experiment to test it, that you use observation, measurement, and then you see if the results then prove your hypothesis or disprove it. And you do it over again to see if you get the same results. So, and we, of course, historically, we generally tell this story about Galileo and Newton as two key figures in the scientific revolution. And this is true. I mean, Newton in particular is very important. And the work that these men do in physics and in astronomy are, of course, foundational. But physics is not the only field that is being transformed in the 17th century, also chemistry, anatomy, and medicine. Part of the difficulty, so that by the late 1600s, they figured out that the blood, the heart acts as a pump, and that blood circulates through the body and is not perhaps made by the liver, but it's William Harvey, who was another Englishman, who discovered that. We also have scholars who discover the clitoris in 1561, which means that perhaps women are not just inverted men. So we get, the influence of anatomy studies that begin to say, no, men and women are physically different. And then we also have the development of what's known as empiricism and sensational psychology. Empiricism is that view, the idea that human beings can indeed be objective observers, that we can do science, that we can trust our senses, that we can devise instruments to extend our senses, like microscopes or telescopes, or I don't know, chemical tubes or whatever. Sensational psychology is the idea that we are what we experience, what our senses bring into our minds and our bodies. This idea of psychology comes out of the work of a doctor and a man who's also a political activist named John Locke, who wrote a book called The Essay Concerning Human Understanding. It's published in 1689. Locke is the one who argues that human beings are born as tabula rasa, as blank slates. And what you become then as an adult is the result of what you experience as a child, as you grow. So you can see that this is going to put a tremendous emphasis on education. How do we get rational thinking human beings? We teach them to be that. So again, and we get the idea developing that therefore men and women, because they are different, need to be educated differently. It gets confusing. We then also have René Descartes, who writes around the same time, late 17th century, who's famous for the statement in Latin of cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes was the kind of guy who had to be convinced of everything, had to have everything proved to him. He was a mathematician. And he began sitting around thinking about, how do I know I exist? And his answer is cogito ergo sum, that because he thinks, because he is conscious, he exists, and isn't the figment of someone's imagination. And for Descartes, Men and women both think, so therefore, there is, not necessarily a reason to think of women and men as fundamentally different. However, others will argue with Descartes that you can't separate the body and the mind, and that women's bodies will disrupt their thoughts, and so therefore you cannot talk about equality between the sexes. So as we move into the 6th, 17th, and 18th centuries, then we get the emergence of what, no surprise, is called the two-sex model, that men and women are fundamentally different, and they begin to better understand the process of reproduction. Okay, so what is this going to mean for the views on gender? This is a cartoon, because of course the way that anatomy studies were done was of course to dissect bodies, but Christian theology has a problem with that. The body is something sacred and will be resurrected, so that anatomy teachers had to resort to hiring body snatchers. And in this cartoon here, this is a caricature of an 18th century well-known doctor who taught anatomy. And here is the night watchman with his rattle and his lantern, who's caught the body snatcher here with the body. And of course, the body snatchers blaming the doctor. But this two-sex model then for men and women has implications also. Again, the idea that because women, as we observe, are generally smaller and have lighter brains, they have smaller bodies with less muscular development and finer nerves. And because they are, subject to the instability of menstrual cycles, childbearing, and lactation, the end result then is, guess what? Women are not capable of deeper, more rational thought. They are more like children than men, more susceptible to nervous disorders and mental illness, closer to nature and thus more emotional. Men, on the other hand, are indeed rational, civilized, capable of being educated, and their mental capacity is stable. So, ideas, okay, so this is where we end up. We get a few philosophers like Descartes who argue that sexism or patriarchy is unscientific, that men are as capable as women of rational thought. Medical doctors tended, though, to lean in the direction of the idea that women are defined by reproduction. Men are defined by their capacity to reason. And it would be only if you gave up any hope of being a mother that you could too develop your mind through study and education. Oh, great. Okay. So the end result is we get the new science and we end up in the same place where men are more important, more rational than women. Although, and we'll see as we go forward then too about the idea of women as natural mothers.